Welcome to Michigan in Focus. I'm Scott McClellan, a Michigan and Minnesota reporter. With me today is Tom Gandert, the Center Square's managing editor. Today, we are going to be looking at Detroit schools. This week, the Detroit School Board approved a $1.1 billion budget that aims to cut 300 positions for a district serving about 48,000 students. The vote came on a 6-1 vote with aiming to cut $37 million in recurring costs. The cost would affect office administration, assistant principals, college transition officers, school culture facilitators, and paraeducators. Tom, you've been reporting in Michigan, especially on education, for about, 20 years? Can you give us some insight on this?
Yeah, Detroit's a very interesting situation because if you remember, I start counting 2017-18 as the first year of the real Detroit district because if you remember what happened, that's when they took back the schools in the Educational Achievement Authority. The EAA was this district of worst schools they tried to fix. It didn't work. So in 2017, they brought those schools back. So what happened there? Well, a couple things happened. You saw Detroit getting an enrollment boost of about 5,000. Went from 45,720 to 50,000. That wasn't because more people were coming. It was because they took back, I think it was about a dozen schools and those students from the Educational Achievement Authority. So here's what happened in Detroit schools. They have a superintendent called Nikolai Beatty, who's in my opinion, a pretty sharp guy, smart dude. And he kind of was turning around the school district. And how he was doing it was, they were losing floods of students. So after 2017-18, they had 50,875 students. The next year they went down, they lost 700 about. They went down to 50,176. But then they had an increase in 2019-20 of 50,895. That was unprecedented. It stopped about a 12 to 13 year run where Detroit Public Schools was losing students every year. They just couldn't stop it. He just showed that he could turn around the district and get more students. And in 2019-20, but we all know what happened in 2019-20. Okay. The pandemic hits. More so in Detroit Public Schools, because you got to remember the teachers union went on a quote safety strike. And they also said, if you put us back in classrooms, we won't show up. That was the safety strike. What happened in Detroit Public Schools is what we're seeing in almost every big school district in this country, and that is they lost students once the pandemic stopped. Detroit was no exception. They went from 50,895 students in 2019-20 to 49,000, then 48,700, and in 2022, about 48,700. But they've lost about 2,000 students since they peaked in 2019-20.
Those 2,000 students, along with those students, I believe the district lost about $20 million in funding attached to those students.
Yeah, if you go by the foundation allowance, they've lost about $19.5 million a year. That's the foundation allowance, okay? But that's just what the state gives them, okay? Now those students account for a lot of federal funding they lost too. So that it's much more than $19 million a year, okay? Now you have to remember the state gets about $683 million a year. Or Detroit gets about $683 million a year. Here's what happened at the same time. Beatty was not counting on the pandemic. Who was? So he was investing in the school district and hiring more staff. So their staffing went from 6,988 in 2017-18 to 7,875. So since 2017-18 to today, 2023, they've added 887 full-time equivalencies all across the board. That's all positions. And on top of that, they've lost 2,130 students. You can't have more staff with less students. That's not a sustainable model. So that's why you're seeing them cut back on it because of the pandemic. It's sad that the pandemic hit Detroit the 1 year that Beatty had showed that he could increase attendance in Detroit, because that was an incredible achievement because Detroit had not seen an increase in attendance. So this is a school district that's suffering from the pandemic. Now, in the teacher's contract, it states this: the parties recognize that the district's ability to provide future salary and wage increases is substantially related to the district's ability to increase student enrollment. So you're going to see cuts happening if he can't turn this around. They're spending multi-millions of dollars now marketing and trying to get additional students to come back. They say it's somewhat successful, that they've lost 2,130 students. They say it would have been worse if they had not done these things to recruit more students back. But here's the problem. In 2017-18, when they had more students, the state of Michigan gave Detroit Public Schools $478 million. 5 years later, it's now $683 million the state's giving them. So that's an increase of more than about $205 million in state funding they're getting. So fewer students, $205 million more in state funding for Detroit Public Schools because they're spending more, because VD invested in the school district and then they got hit by the pandemic. So it's going to see interesting how this plays out over the next several years to see if he can get Detroit back on track to increasing the enrollment, which he was just getting to in 2019-20 when the pandemic hit. And what's happening in Detroit is happening in every school district. If you look, Chicago, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, every large school district is seeing a loss of students since the pandemic hit.
I think Detroit schools are also fighting inflation. They said that their operation costs for contract vendors will increase by $18 million. Utility costs will increase by $13 million. And there's about $30 million in future negotiated salary raises that the district is hoping to implement over the next couple of years.
Right. When we talk about investment, let's look at 2017-18. The school district had 3,455 teachers, according to the state of Michigan. That's 2017-18. You go forward to today, 2022-23, they got 3,827. So fewer students, 400 more teachers. All right. Now the state of Michigan's definition of teachers it includes more than classroom teachers. Unfortunately, they're not very precise. So that figure also includes counselors, psychologists, those kind of things. And counselors or psychologists are things that every school district is adding across the country because of the pandemic too. Because the emotional well-being of the students was in question. So that a lot of them had to hire these extra people. And the interesting thing is at the end of 2024, all the federal pandemic money is going to be gone. So school districts are going to have to realign staffing they have going forward.
Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Scott McClellan. Please subscribe, and thanks for listening.